Hey everybody, I'm Brian Contos. I'm the Chief Security Officer with Phosphorus Cybersecurity. Today's presentation is Cameras, CACs, and Clocks. Enterprise IoT Security Sucks. This is a story of 2 million interrogated IoT devices. So let's just jump right in. A little bit about my background. I've been in cyber for about 25 years. I've worked all over the world, mostly pre-COVID. Prior to Phosphorus, I started my career with DISA, then later Bell Labs, and then just started building startup companies. ArcSight, Riptech, Imperva, Solera Networks, and a few others. I sit on a couple different boards. I've written some books. In fact, in 2007, I wrote a book with the former director of the NSA, Bill Kroll, which was focused particularly on physical and logical security convergence, which took IoT sort of into consideration a little bit before its day, however. But certainly some of the tenets of that research fall into what we're going to be talking about today. So before we start, a little bit of background on the research. So we started this in 2017, and it's actually still ongoing. And we've looked at millions and millions of production, customer, enterprise IoT devices. So this isn't in a lab environment. These are actually real enterprise IoT devices running in operation today. Most of these customers are what you'd consider Fortune 500, Global 2000, government agencies. And what we're focusing on again is enterprise IoT. It's not consumer IoT, which you might think of as a Ring doorbell, a Roomba vacuum cleaner, an Alexa, these types of cloud-managed IoT devices. But the term IoT is very expansive. You can incorporate industrial IoT, OT devices like SCADA and weapon systems, battlefield of things as well, Industry 4.0, smart buildings, smart cities, and so many other things. For the sake of this presentation, we really just want to focus on those IoT devices that you commonly find in the enterprises. In addition to this, we're not going to be focusing on taking a device, ripping apart the hardware, pulling out an oscilloscope, looking at the chips, dissecting the firmware for vulnerabilities. That's valuable. There's a lot of great presentations on that, but this is really about enterprise operations of IoT devices. So what are we going to cover? I'm going to give you a very short, extremely short technical history with the IoT primer just to sort of frame things. And then we're really going to just jump into the stats, some really interesting war stories from the trenches, who some of the biggest offenders are in terms of IoT devices, and then to make things a little fun at the end, what we can learn from Star Wars in terms of how to deal with enterprise IoT security risk mitigation. So here's that short historical primer. I think this is a really great way to frame IoT. So if we think about innovations of civilization, sort of from the dawn of history, if you will, we had cave paintings in 20,000 BC. But we tend to have these big leaps forward when things jump out, whether that's the alphabet or written language using paper, things of that nature. But I draw your attention to 1804 here with Joseph Marie Jacquard, and he invented the Automatic Loom. Now this is really interesting. Making blankets and rugs and textiles before this was all done completely manual. There was no automation involved. It was very laborious. And he invented this device, which was essentially the predecessor to the computer. It was a mechanical computer, but it had input, it had output, it had storage. And if you look at some of these pictures, you can see it looks like punch cards or, punch tape even, which was the predecessor to punched cards. And that's how it was processing this information. And essentially what happened was it allowed these manufacturers of these textiles to increase productivity, sometimes over 1,000%. So they were pretty amazing. You could have multiple looms inside a factory. So arguably, this is the world's first computer, leveraging mechanical automation, but some level of automation to increase productivity. The backstory to this is actually pretty interesting because the employees, they were nervous about this. They're like, look, we're going to lose our jobs to this computer. They didn't call it a computer, but we're going to lose our jobs to this thing. So they actually broke into the factories one night and they smashed them. They destroyed them. And I always thought it was very ironic that the world's first computer suffered an insider threat. And we see those insider threats as well on the IoT side. And then, of course, once we get over to, post ARPANET, like 1969, and we get over to 1973 when we start developing TCP/IP and Ethernet comes out. We start having these major leaps forward. The personal computer in 1980. But from an IoT side, the first sort of roots, the inkling, we didn't call it IoT then, it probably really shouldn't be considered IoT, was in 1982. A Coke machine was actually connected to ARPANET to tell folks how many cans were still in there. There's actually modern IoT versions that live in vending machines today that do exactly that thing, probably built a little bit better. Then we had web browsers. The first official IoT device, and this was actually before the term IoT came out, which wasn't even until I think 1999, but it was a TCP/IP toaster. That was the first official IoT device, and that was back in 1990. Then Linux comes out in 91. We've got cameras on the web, and of course security cameras now are one of the most common IoT devices we see in the enterprise, and also one of the most commonly exploited. There's lots of things you can do there. Google's founded in 98. Then LG in 99 announces the first internet-enabled refrigerator. I live in Silicon Valley, and I remember going to a Fry's Electronics and seeing these types of things and going, oh, that's really cool. I'm not sure how practical the use cases are, but it's a really cool idea. The iPhone comes out in 2007, and then we just see a whole bunch of stuff. Self-driving cars. Dublin, Ireland becomes the first IoT city. And now we're seeing global IoT sensors tracking everything from traffic and weather and agricultural systems and temperature and how humans actually move in different environments, and just massive amounts of data being fed up and analyzed into satellite systems from disparate IoT devices. Absolutely tremendous. It's $1 trillion market, and there's just billions and billions and billions now of connected IoT devices, far more than traditional IT devices, of course. But even with all this great innovation that we've had throughout these many centuries, we see people trying to exploit them, right? So this is a security discussion, so I really want to jump into sort of how innovations are often taken advantage of. And I thought a really easy way to look at this was look at when the commercialization first kicked in for a certain advancement, and then when somebody tried to exploit it. So the first example, pretty low tech by today's standards, but using the sea for trade. The first commercialization of the sea, when somebody says, hey, I have some stuff over here, why don't we stick out on a boat and sell it to these folks over here? First records are about 3000 BC. That was in the Mediterranean Sea. The first pirates weren't recorded until about 1300 BC. That's about a 1700-year threat window. That's a pretty big threat window when somebody said, why don't we just rob that boat? Then we moved from sea to air. So in 1859, John Weiss had this idea. He would go ahead and move things like mail and other things of that nature via hot air balloon. Really cool idea. It crashed and burned. It literally crashed and burned. But we didn't have the first hijacking until 1931, and that was actually in Peru. The first commercialization of space in the form of satellites was 1962. We haven't seen a lot of exploitation in space as it relates to satellite exploitation or satellite warfare, if you will. There have been some isolated cases. In 2015, there was the Trula data theft, which had a command and control system that leveraged satellites. But the juice really isn't worth the squeeze in most cases. That's kind of the realm of nation states, and we just haven't seen a lot of satellite warfare happening. Next is the commercialization of the internet, right? Roughly around 1988, that's when NSFNet and MCI Mail said, hey, you've got email users, we've got email users. Let's charge them, and they can email each other. What a novel concept. Right about the same time, we had the Morris worm. And some of you might be familiar with that, but it took advantage of R commands and finger and things like that, and very quickly propagated amongst connected devices, far quicker than it was supposed to propagate. But that set the threat window to about 0. So we started at about 1700 years, and now we're about 0. And now we talk about the commercialization of IoT. This one's a little bit harder to pin down, but it's roughly about 2010 when it became commercially popular. We'll just say that. In about 2016, we had the Mirai botnet. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but that's considered by most people to be the first IoT malware, first IoT relevant attack. So let's just jump into some of the statistics now. So again, Phosphorus has been researching organizations since 2007. millions of devices, Global 2000s, Fortune 500s, government agencies, large enterprises all around the world. And what we found is about 67% of the organizations we work with have had a known IoT security breach. Now, we don't have great statistics on the breaches we don't know about, of course, but I'd hazard to guess, and I think you're probably thinking the same thing, that number is probably a lot higher. They're just not aware of it because there's not a lot of situational awareness when it comes to IoT. But almost 70% of these devices, or almost 70% of these organizations have had a known breach related to IoT. And when we talk about IoT breaches, it's all the same stuff that you think about on the IT side. Devices can be compromised with malware, they can be added to botnets, they can be leveraged for ransomware. Video cameras can be turned on to the people that installed them, and the audio is turned on and they're actually siphoning information off. They're taking video feeds and spying on these individuals. Oftentimes people will use the compromise of an IoT device to leapfrog to an IT device. We've seen cases where devices have been compromised and an IoT device, they grab sensitive information via various hacker tools, if you will, take that information back to that IoT device, compress it up, and siphon it out the organization to steal sensitive data. And of course, there can be physical issues as well, unlocking doors, shutting down power, turning video cameras off again, these types of things. So the same cyber attacks we see on IT, we also see on IoT. And IoT can sometimes be used as a leapfrog to IT attacks. In addition to that, of course, IoT attacks can have a big impact on the physical world as well, all the way up to and including asset destruction in some cases. So a couple more stats here. When we started talking to security teams to figure out, hey, do you folks really have your arms around at least an inventory? Do you know what IoT devices you have? About 20% said, yeah, we can identify most of them. 80% don't really have a good clue about what devices they have. And one of the reasons is there's just so many, and there's so many different groups that deploy these in different organizations that they just don't have an idea. On the positive side, though, they realize it's a security issue, and almost every organization has started increasing spending as it relates to IoT security. So that's a positive note. This slide, I just said yikes. I didn't really know what else to call it. So I went over to Shodan, and I think most of you are familiar with that, the Shodan search engine, to see which devices are internet accessible, if you will. And I just typed in a couple terms that you would think of for IoT devices. I've got camera, voice over IP, printer, and UPS. So not very scientific, just typed them in. But what we find here is almost 5 million cameras, over 250,000 voice over IP phones, 83,000 plus printers, and almost 14,000 UPS systems, which, oh my gosh. And the thing about UPS systems, I won't tell you, but you can Google this. The password is almost never changed, and it's a very, very simple password on these. It's actually the same credential for username and password on these devices. I don't know why they would be exposed on the internet. But IoT devices don't need to be exposed to the internet for these attacks to happen, but certainly the fact that many of them are increase the likelihood. Also, we're seeing a lot of nation states now paying attention to IoT and investing quite a bit. And this is globally. So Russia has this tool called Frontin, which was developed for them by some contractors, specifically for the Russian FSB. And this was an IoT hacking tool designed to find, compromise, and compromise IoT devices, install command and control software, and do whatever they wanted from that point, or also use that as a jumping off point to get in deeper into organizations. Interestingly, a hacking group called Digital Revolution got their hands on Frontin and released the code, so you can get it from torrents and all the places that you like to get your hacking tools from. Another interesting case is there have been IoT devices that have been banned. Actually, the U.S. House of Representatives has passed bills that prohibit federal agencies and contractors from actually using certain IoT devices. So, I mean, they're that well known to have that level of vulnerability that they're just not allowed. So let's just jump into some stories from the trenches. These are always really interesting. And, I mentioned earlier Mirai botnet. So for those of you who aren't aware, again, that's from 2016. I'll go a little bit deeper. Very, very simple attack. Essentially, some attackers scanned the internet. We just saw what you could do with Shodan, looking for specifically video cameras to start with. that were running Telnet, and they were running Telnet on port 23 and port 2323 on these video cameras. And if they found one that they could get access to, they tried the default password, and they tried a handful, I think about a half dozen or a dozen very common passwords as well if the default password wasn't being used. Well, what was interesting is there was a lot of devices that were, one, accessible, two, they were accessible via Telnet, and three, they were running a default or a very common password. So there was enough of these devices taken over to actually create a pretty big botnet. But one of the issues that's unique in IoT is organizations and manufacturers that make IoT devices aren't necessarily software development organizations. They don't have a secure software development lifecycle. In fact, a lot of the times they just want to take this thing and they want to get it online, however they do that. So they do it on the cheap, they do it as quickly as possible, and they use a lot of shared libraries. There's a lot of white labeling done where I'll grab this component and that component because it's all about speed. I just want to put this thing online. Certainly security is not an issue. So when it came to Mirai, when they found all these cameras with this insecure build, what they also started finding, what these attackers found, was that there was voice over IP phones and printers and other devices that had very similar configurations. So they got added to the mix as well, and it wasn't just cameras. But fast forward now that they've got this huge botnet that they're controlling, cameras, printers, voice over IP phones, so on and so forth, with their command and control software, and they launched DDoS attacks, and they're actually able to severely disrupt pretty big tech companies, Twitter, PayPal, Netflix, GitHub, and some telecoms and many, many others. So again, this was a super simple attack. It's hard to even call it an attack. It was more of just like a search. And then they uploaded some malicious software and they caused great harm. And that was with Mirai botnet. Now the sad thing is, because the half-life of most firmware, meaning that firmware usually sits there vulnerable on these devices for a very long time, and passwords are often pretty weak or default, means that there's devices today that are still vulnerable to this specific attack, and it's still floating around the internet, even though it started back in 2016. Even worse, there's still devices that are compromised, and they're running the malicious code, and the organizations has all these cameras or printers or phones or whatever they have that are infected, and they don't even know it. Right? So pretty sad state of affairs. So passwords. So this is a really interesting thing. When we think about passwords or just credentials as a general term, it's like the most basic step in security. But what we find is about 50% on average of the devices we encounter have default passwords. Now, while that's the average, there's some interesting skews to each side. There's some audio video equipment IoT devices, for example, where we find about 95% of the time it's default credentials. And then there's some other devices as well where when you install them, the default password has to be changed as part of the installation process, which is generally a good idea. So there's some different sides to this curve, but sadly when we do find a device that's not a default password, and in fact the password has been changed, one, it's usually not changed to something very good because, again, people just have so many IoT devices. They tend to give them a very simple name and they give everything the same password. But usually the password was only changed once. For that printer, or that KVM switch, or that rack, or that UPS system, maybe it was changed at the point of installation 5, 10 years ago. Who knows? But another problem is about 100% of the passwords are out of compliance in terms of how often are they rotated, every 30, 60, 90 days. Usually they're not. Are they centrally managed? Probably not. There's probably no PAM integration with like a HashiCorp, Thycotic, CyberArk, tools of that nature. And then the complexity's off, right? Maybe it's just ABC 1, 2, 3. It's not uppercase, lowercase, numbers, special characters, all the things that we know as best practices. So here's an interesting case. We were working with a financial services organization that was involved with stock trading, and they had these atomic clocks. These were actually cesium clocks. And all these devices I'm showing, by the way, it's not the actual brand that popped up there. This is just a photo to give you a representation. But what was interesting here is they knew about 6 of these clocks. And these aren't cheap clocks. They're about 12K each, which isn't expensive for some organizations, but it's still quite a bit of money. But they knew about 6 of them. We actually discovered 15 of them. So more than half, they weren't aware that they had them. So they had all these cesium atomic clocks, and they're very important for their role. And as many of you probably know, if I buy a stock and you buy a stock and you get a 2 millisecond advantage over me, that can have a dramatic and profound financial impact, right? So they're really important. What was interesting about these clocks is there were no CVEs on these. And I don't want to say it's because they were ultra secure. They were good devices, but they're pretty esoteric. So not a lot of people are poking them and prodding them. It's not like a common printer or camera or something like that. But what was really interesting, again, was the inventory issue. They just had no idea they had those devices there. So because of that, there was nobody watching the security, making sure they were updated. They had strong passwords and that sort of thing. So a lot of the time, it's just knowing what you've got. And in our research, what we've actually discovered, and these numbers actually blew me away before I really started getting involved with these organizations, there's about 3 to 5 IoT devices per employee. So this is the craziest looking possible chart to show that. But if you just look at 10,000 employees, for example, 10,000 employees, you probably have somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 IoT devices. That's a lot of devices. And it's way more devices than you could possibly manually manage in terms of taking care of the firmware and taking care of the passwords and turning off unneeded services. It's just completely untenable. You need automated tools. You need a centralized process to handle that. But it just kind of shows you the breadth and depth of this problem. Now, if you look at law firms, for example, they'll have a little bit less. You look at retailers, they'll actually have quite a bit more. So it kind of depends on industry, but on average, take a look at your organization, there's probably about 3 to 5 IoT devices per employee, right? And we'll get into some of the IoT devices that we see quite a bit of in the worst offenders, and you'll start going, oh, okay, yeah, if I start including these things, I can completely see how that goes. And just like with the stock exchange, we were talking about those cesium clocks, when we go into organizations to do a proof of value, and we say, hey, how many devices do you think you have, IoT devices? And they'll say, I don't know, I have X. Almost 100% of the time, their numbers are off by about 40 to 60%. So again, they just didn't know about half of their devices in their environment. So we talked about printers a little bit before. Printers are really a special case because everyone's got them and everyone's got a lot of them. We work with some folks in the hospitality industry, for example, where they have tens and tens of thousands of printers, just printers, different models and brands and versions and things like that, but they have lots of printers. Now the thing about printers is most sort of enterprise level printers have about a 20 gig hard drive. It's not huge, it's not small, but it's a pretty good size hard drive. And what had happened is some attackers had gotten access to these printers, which, by the way, most of these run common operating systems like Linux or Android and things of this nature. In fact, across all IoT, a flavor of Linux or a flavor of Android is by far the most common thing that you'll find. And by the way, they have a lot of the same capabilities, services. In the case of printers, however, they're far more promiscuous in running so many different protocols. They've got every protocol imaginable because they want to be easy to use. They want people to be able to connect to them and use them. It's the point of the printer. So from that perspective, it makes great sense. But attackers know that, and because they know that, they take advantage of the fact that those printers are so promiscuous and there are so many ways to connect with them. So in this particular case, some attackers had gained access to the printer. They had uploaded some of their tools. And this was only to a few dozen printers at the time, but it did expand greatly to hundreds later on. And they used those to go out searching for other critical devices on the network, IT devices primarily. And from them, they were extracting data. This was all about intellectual property theft. They were extracting the data, and then they were storing it on those 20 gig hard drives. And I'll get to what happens next. Well, a lot of this activity, because it was all being controlled through various remote connectivity controls and C2 and things of that nature, it created logs. And those logs were showing up in Splunk. And they were anomalous. And they said, hey, we've got a lot of printers that seem to be pretty chatty, and we're not really sure why. And then what they were seeing was data exfiltration. And these printers, they were being set up to exfil data over ICMP. Why? Because everybody allows ICMP out. And even if it's shut off, network ops turns it back on to do some testing. They forget to turn it off. Just a really easy way to exfiltrate data. You have to make the packets pretty small. Takes a little bit longer, but it usually goes under the radar. So they were using these printers to grab IT-sensitive data, compressing it up, exfiltrating out over ICMP, which eventually caused some alarms to go off. And what they found was when they started looking at these printers and they say, God, it's not just one or two. We have several dozen now, more than 100 now. They're infected. It was just the firmware. They're running really old firmware. Some of these devices hadn't been updated in up to 10 years. Most of them hadn't been upgraded for about 4 or 5 years at least. So they were just sitting there vulnerable. They were doing their job. They were working fine as printers. And usually most people don't pay attention to a printer until it stops, well, printing. So the fact that they were running all this old firmware just made them a big target with a big juicy hard drive and an easy way to exfiltrate that data out. Now, talking about firmware, about 26% of the devices we counter have end-of-life firmware, meaning that there's just nothing we can do with that firmware. It's completely end-of-life. If you're running it, you have to get on a newer version of it. Of the remaining 74%, the average age was 6 years old. Think about your smartphone. It probably wouldn't work if you hadn't updated things in 6 years, and I'm almost certain it wouldn't work. But now you're talking about your enterprise devices, again, all of your key systems, especially the systems that manage other systems. And that's really a scary stat, because if we think about it again, there's not a lot of difference between an IT device and an IoT device in terms of capability, network access, and the type of negative ramifications it can cause upon your environment. And again, with IoT, you can even cause physical harm. So if I went and told you 26% of your IT devices were our end-of-life firmware, you'd jump off this video right now and you'd go fix those. That's how serious this is. So here was a case that I thought was pretty interesting too. This was very recently. This was a DDoS attack against a Microsoft Azure customer. And they had a little over 10,000 IoT devices that were compromised. And there was no real specific sort of vulnerability that was being compromised. It was just general vulnerabilities that tend to sit on these systems. A lot of them run high-level vulnerabilities, and they have a lot of open services to get in. They're running clear text protocols like FTP, TFTP, Telnet. They've got things that maybe they don't need to be running in terms of various services, old TLS, self-signed certs, all sorts of vulnerabilities just in terms of the services they're running, their configurations, and of course any native vulnerabilities. So there's no really rhyme or reason to say it was just this version of a KVM switch that was exploited and used for a DDoS attack. But what was interesting about this particular attack against these Azure customers was that it ended up being 3.4 terabits per second. Now, a 3.47 terabit per second DDoS attack is the largest DDoS attack in history. Not the largest IoT DDoS in history, but the largest attack in history, regardless of IT or IoT. So again, this just gives you a sense of the power of these devices. And once you grasp that it's just a Linux server, yeah, it acts as a camera or acts as a UPS system or acts as a rack, whatever, but it's a computer. So they have these capabilities and they can cause these negative ramifications. So when we start digging into the actual statistics around the vulnerabilities, what we found, and this is probably one of the most frightening statistics so far, the CVSS scores, so scores of 1 to 10, 10 being the most grievous, 50% of the devices have a score of an 8. An additional 18% have scores of 9 or 10. These are high to critical level vulnerabilities. These are the type of vulnerabilities where you don't need local access. You can do remote exploitation. They're very severe. The great majority of the vulnerabilities discovered on these devices were 8s, 9s, and 10s. That's a scary thought. Again, this is one of those things where if these were your IT devices, you'd be like, oh my God, what can I do? But because IoT devices historically have been so hard to first of all, just discover, then manage the passwords, address the vulnerabilities in the patching and the firmware, manage services, etc., nothing's been done. And I guess a good analogy for this is IoT security today is kind of like IT security was in 1995. And this is right about when I started my career in security. But there's no inventory, or very little, or was kept on a spreadsheet somewhere manually. Poor passwords. There was a password policy that was written by your InfoSec team, but it was just a policy. And there was poor patch management, right? It just wasn't taken care of. That's the same thing we're seeing on IoT today. We've gotten past most of these issues by and large in the IT world, but in the IoT world, we're still stuck in Coolio's Gangster Paradise Xena Princess Warrior timeframe in Windows NT 3.51. And I remember when I started, just to kind of frame sort of what, the types of projects back then, my first project, and a lot of you might recognize this US robotics modem here. I was on this project called UMAP, the Unauthorized Modem Abatement Project. What a great acronym. All it meant is, hey, we have all these modems around our campus. We've got to figure out if we need them because they're backdoors for hackers, and they're going to get in and do hacker stuff, like Angelina Jolie did as acid burn in Hackers, right? So that was a project. So I used this tool in that next picture, which is Tone Loc, which was written by Minor Threat and Mucho Mas and ran under DOS. And I actually would scan the entire phone system and PBX lines to figure out which ones were responding as a phone, a fax machine, or a actual modem. And then based on that, I'd have to physically go hunt it down and figure out who owned it and say, do you need this or not? If you don't, I could unplug it. So I had literally boxes and boxes of these things. Not as nice as some of these US robotics ones, but some pretty bad ones. Also at this time, we were going to start scanning for vulnerabilities, which was somewhat of a new concept. So I had this tool that Dan Farmer wrote called Satan, Security Analysis Tool for Analyzing Networks, which is how I learned how to write Perl, because the whole thing was written in Perl. And I ran it on this Sun Spark 1 Plus pizza box, which is kind of hidden behind my video there. And that's what I used for scanning for vulnerabilities. And we said, hey, you know what we need? We need a firewall now. There's this thing called the firewall. We're not just going to use access control lists in our routers. So I actually turned the device that I was doing vulnerability scanning on. I didn't take Satan off of it, but we actually threw a couple NICs on there, or one more NIC, so we would have two. So that became our firewall. And I loaded Checkpoint on there with 3.5-inch floppy disks. So the device I was using for my firewall was actually the device that we were also using for vulnerability scanning. And then we eventually threw a third NIC on there because that was our DMZ, because we're super secure. It was crazy. We didn't know what we were doing. We were just doing stuff. But again, that was IT security back in the mid-90s, and that's kind of where IoT security is today. So now let's dive into the biggest IoT offenders. And these are the devices where we see sort of the most grievous issues across the board. Now, we see a lot of other devices that I'm not listing here, but we just had to sort of condense it into the ones that keep on ringing out as being problematic. Again, the pictures that you see here are not the actual brands. I'm not going to call anybody out here. That's not the focus here. But KVM switches. Again, most of you are probably familiar with KVM switches. But a KVM switch, you stick it in a rack, you connect it to multiple computers, and it lets you control keyboard and mouse and video, and sometimes you can cycle power as well. We come across a lot of these devices that are running like Linux Ubuntu version 10. Well, that's from 2010. Right? I think the latest version now is 21 point something. It's a little bit past 21.1. So it's running old stuff, and because of that, it doesn't just have a few, but they have hundreds of vulnerabilities. Now think about this. I've spent a lot of money on my endpoint security and application security, identity this, and network security that, and now I've got this KVM switch that can backdoor into all these devices, running a version of Linux that's more than a decade old, that if I'm an attacker and I can compromise that, I can do a lot of malicious things to those devices that are connected. I can probably power them off. I can change configurations. I can, modify stuff, steal stuff, whatever I wanted to do. So that's a huge backdoor. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of nation states, and we talked about Russia earlier, are building these tools, because why bang your head through the firewall and the IPS and the encryption that and application security and endpoint security when I can just go around that back door? Again, like 1995 with that US robotics modem plugged into the back of that Windows NT 351 server in the back of the data center that everybody forgot about, right? So KVM switches, one of the biggest offenders that we see out there. Another big one, lights out management controls. So if you look at the back of this server, we see a couple Ethernet ports on the right and something that looks like an Ethernet port where that arrow is. Well, that's not an Ethernet port. That's a lights out management port. Right? That's what you're going to use for management of these devices. Well, the thing about these is there's a few different flavors. There's HP has ILO, Dell has iDRAC, Supermicro has IPMI. So there's a few different flavors. Those are the main ones. They're just little Linux servers. In fact, there's malware specifically designed to target those little Linux servers for lights out management systems. And again, like the KVM switches, but a little bit more powerful actually, these lights out management controls bypass all that other security that you've put on top of that server. So you could have $10 million of endpoint security on top of this thing, but if that interface isn't secure, if it's running a default password, for example, or a weak password, or it has a vulnerability in it that can be exploited because that version of Linux or VxWorks that's running on that has not been updated in the last 10 years, that's a problem. Because now as an attacker, the things I can do for that is I can shut the system down, I can change the network settings, I can run a shell. Some of these guys I can pop open a virtual terminal as well. I can upload software or malware. I can do all the bad stuff that an attacker would want to do. And again, most of your critical servers are going to have these devices. And some people say, oh, well, you know, I didn't even know that thing was there. And that's the problem, again, because there's no good inventory for discovery for a lot of these products. Server cabinets and racks. This is another one that people tend to go, oh, those do have a lot of IoT devices. They sure do. UPS systems, which are notorious for having the vendor's default password, which takes about 5 seconds to find if you Google it. Cooling systems, cable management, tamper resistance, sensors, and all sorts of other things, depending on how fancy that rack happens to be. And they're really cool and they're really capable. They're almost always running the oldest firmware known to man. And the reason for that, I think, the primary reason is if I want to upload all the firmware on my rack, including my UPS system and everything else, I need to reboot that system in most cases, which means all those devices that are relying on that, switching gear, routing gear, computer systems, etc., they're going to have to be rebooted as well. So there has to be a change window. And when people schedule change windows, they don't always think about IoT devices, unfortunately, which causes this problem. So these devices are frequently vulnerable. And a lot of these are also tied to KVM switches that we talked about earlier, exposing you to a lot of problems. Physical access controllers. Here's another case where you probably have oodles and oodles of these throughout your environment, whether it's biometrics or a PIN or a scan card or a CAC system, whatever the solution might be. Again, these are Linux devices that are running on the network. And in one particular case, we're working with a customer, and they had the system deployed. It was all default passwords, but if those passwords were not default, and it's crazy to find the default passwords on door locks. It's crazy to think, but you always find it. They had 3 critical CVEs. So had that default password not been there, it would have been easy enough to get through one of the critical one of the 3. You could pick the one that you like most to get into that system. And we're sitting with the CISO and their team, and we're actually able to show them with a click of a button, we could have locked or unlocked all 6,400 door lock systems that they had throughout this financial services company. And again, the IoT devices can have that impact on the physical world. Printers. We talked a little bit about printers before. They're certainly one of the most commonly attacked devices, especially from nation states, but cyber criminals like them too. If any of you were at Black Hat back in 2019 in Vegas, there was some research that was released where they found critical level vulnerabilities. Again, these are level 10 vulnerabilities on over 10,000 different printer types and brands. And there's just so many different types of printers out there, but that's pretty incredible. Over 10,000 devices had critical level vulnerabilities. And again, they're highly promiscuous. They're running a lot of services. They've got wired and wireless connections. They probably have Bluetooth. They might be running other protocols as well. You can manage it via HTTPS or SSH. Some of you can telnet into. They're just very, very open, and that's taking advantage. And again, because a lot of them have that big storage drive, it's great to use them to attack IT devices and exfiltrate your data out the way we talked about it before. But again, it's one of the biggest targets for state-sponsored hackers. I would say it's probably in the top 3. Next one, voice over IP phones and video conferencing systems. Like printers, organizations have a ton of voice over IP systems. And even when people weren't at the office, there's still so many active IoT systems that we actually saw an uptick in the number of attacks on IoT devices. But now, I guess they're calling it the Great Return. Here in Silicon Valley, we see, the likes of Apple and Facebook and Google. People are all going back to work again. Traffic's increasing because of that, which is usually a pretty good sign. Probably an IoT device could detect that. But there's a lot of these voice over IP phones, and they're usually running a flavor of Android. What we find with a lot of these devices is they've got undocumented SSH administration capabilities running on them, with default credentials. Again, and a lot of this goes back to what we were talking about before with the manufacturers of some of these devices aren't necessarily software development houses. They're more, they manufacture things, sometimes like farm equipment and things of that nature. So they have a small crew. They're not putting a lot of time and effort into testing, certainly not looking at security. If they are, it's very little. And because of that, they're saying, well, I'm just going to white label that. I'm going to use that library from that group. And they might not even know they have that undocumented SSH with default credentials, right? And it just got rolled out that way because they hadn't done that level of testing. So that's a pretty scary thing. With this one organization, I guess you can call this a beacon of hope, but maybe it's kind of sad. They had 31,000 phones. Only 700 had a critical level CVE. As we know, it really only takes one. So these, again, are an example of something that there's just so many. They're so voluminous, 31,000 phone systems. If you wanted to upgrade the firmware or rotate the passwords every 90 days that you use for managing those or whatever steps, it would be impossible to try to do these things manually. And then the last group I wanted to cover were our security cameras. These suck the most. There's so many of them, and there's so many problems. Again, some of these cameras ship directly from their manufacturers with the malware already installed. So you skip the middleman. You just go straight to being infected and having your device controlled. These cameras have been known to actually turn on when they're supposed to be off. They're known to record audio when they're supposed to be on mute. And they also take these streams and they can pipe them back to various countries. So that's a problem right there. And again, a lot of these devices have been banned. But cameras are devices that, if they're compromised, they can certainly be used for spying. We mentioned some of the attacks that are very common in IT and IoT and how they're the same, from ransomware to data theft, DDoS, command and control, malware distribution, things of that nature. One case we were working with a customer, I think they had something like 9,000 or 9,500, a lot. They had a lot of video cameras. And they had been cryptojacked. Which most of you probably know that means I want to take this device and I want to use it to mine crypto. So they had all these cameras that were doing crypto mining. And the way they detected it, I'd love to say it was some cool SIM tool or alerted this. It was their power bill. Their power bill was really, really high, and they didn't know why. If you've ever looked at organizations that do crypto mining, it's pretty energy intensive. So that's how they found it. These guys are usually running Linux, usually at some form of like BusyBox, which is a common piece that's on there. And the thing that's interesting about video cameras is a lot of the older ones are designed so I have 10,000 cameras, but they all have to have the exact same password that's talking to the management console, like something like you see here in the middle. Which is an architectural flaw. I mean, you could set it up, and there's some newer ones where you have the streaming password is the same, but the management password's different. So it has two different passwords because of that issue. So when you're talking about password management on these things, you have to keep in mind that, hey, if you are going to change the password and use something complicated, now I have to do it for all 10,000 devices, and it has to be the same thing. It has to be a group password. Again, from a security perspective, not a great design, but sometimes you have to work within the limitations of those devices as well. So again, virtually every organization has hundreds, if not thousands, or even tens of thousands of these types of devices. There's often finger pointing when it comes to cameras. Well, I thought facilities took care of that. No, I thought IT did. No, I think it was supposed to be security. And it's kind of like Spider-Man, right? They're all pointing at each other. It's just very commonly targeted, and they tend to be very easy to take advantage of. And on the consumer side, again, we're not focusing too much on the consumer side here, but one of the most popular cameras on Amazon last year, the most popular camera, highest rated, approved this and that, shipped with malware already installed on it. So it wasn't some esoteric device that you probably wouldn't come across. So now let's get into Star Wars and what we can learn from Star Wars as it relates to mitigating the risk for IoT devices. I think there's some good lessons learned here. So the first thing is discovery. We need to know what we've got if we want to be able to remediate these risks. You can't remediate without discovery, so discovery is very important. And there's some old school ways that have been done historically to address discovery that aren't horrible, but they don't really scale that well for IoTs. Take NBAD solutions, which are off of some span port, sniffing the traffic. Most IoT traffic, thankfully, is encrypted. So if you're sniffing the traffic and all you're getting is encrypted data, you're not getting very much information. Plus the information that you can glean from sniffing a device, it might tell you I'm a printer, or maybe even I'm an HP printer, but it's not going to get down to the detail that you need, a version, model, firmware, what are the dynamics of the credentials, services, etc. that you need if you want to do remediation. Knowing that something is a printer isn't a very good gauge. So the NBADs tend not to work that well. Also, legacy vulnerability scanners, things that are really designed for IT, such as the Qualys, the Tenables, the Rapid7. They're great at what they do, but usually they work by sending malformed packets when they're trying to do discovery, which is fine with IT. With IoT, if you send a malformed packet, especially on the OT side of the world, where you really don't want to be scanning most of the time, you can knock that device offline, which impacts availability, of course, because it's offline, has all sorts of other ramifications. So that's not a great approach for IoT. And a lot of inventory discovery systems as well, they'll just look at the MAC, more specifically the first 3 octets, the OUI, the organizationally unique identifier of that MAC address. And when they do that, they say, oh, you're a Jet Direct, you must be this. Well, that doesn't work great in IoT. There's a lot of false positives because that MAC identifier could be the same for a printer or for a phone or for a voice conferencing system, or a million other things in between. So there's lots of false positives with that. So it really doesn't work very well. So some alternatives are like enterprise IoT security platforms. And some of the things that they do is they can do something like a very short port scan, check out some various ports, and then do a banner grab to kind of get a level set of, hey, here are some of the devices on the network that look like they might be IoT devices. Or they can jack into these NBADs and vulnerability scanners and other asset inventories to kind of create that jumping off point. And they say, okay, in your environment, we think there's probably around 50,000 IoT devices based on the scanning and based on these integration pieces. But then it goes to the next level, which is called interrogation. So this is the part where it's like C3PO. Instead of bombarding it with malformed packets or trying to sniff devices, what we're actually doing in this case is we're speaking the language of that device in its native tongue. So you're talking to the printer the way it wants to be spoken to. You're talking with the KVM switches, the gunshot detection device, the elevator shaft, HVAC systems, whatever they are, in that language, right? And based on doing that, you're doing interrogation, either authenticated or unauthenticated, to glean all those details, firmware, serial number, what they're running, etc. And that allows you to scale, because now very quickly you're ascertaining what these devices are that I have with a tremendous amount of detail. And the cool thing about this is you have a unique identifier. So as a device switches from wired to wireless, well, the MAC address changes, but so does the IP. So you're not pegged to that IP address or that MAC address. You're actually fingerprinting that actual device based on its scalability of its capabilities. So being able to speak the language of the devices is really, really critical. And there's a lot of complexity and subtlety that has to happen behind the scenes. But from your perspective, you're essentially just running a scan and letting it do its interrogation of those devices. That's why enterprise IoT security platforms are really so popular. Now I've discovered all these devices, I want to look at hardening and upgrading these devices so they're not on vulnerable versions of firmware. So again, back in the day, a lot of people would say, well, I'm just going to throw everything on a VLAN. Well, that's nice, and I don't think VLANs are bad. I think they're a good approach, but the problem with that is, again, you have 3 to 5 IoT devices for employees. You probably don't even know what you have. So trying to put everything on a VLAN, first of all, is technically challenging to scale that, but it also can be extremely expensive. And we're talking millions of dollars in this approach to be able to VLAN all those devices, and you're still going to miss stuff, and there's still going to be misconfigurations. Now, at the end of the day, the worst part is you're not fixing it. It's like saying, oh, I just cut my hand. So instead of going to the doctor and getting stitches, I'm just going to put a plastic bag around it. Well, I'm not getting blood on my other hand, so that's good. But at the end of the day, I still have a cut hand in a bag. And that's kind of what VLANing is like. You still need to fix that device. You still want to make sure that the firmware and the credentials and everything are secure. So once you find these devices with these enterprise IoT security platforms, you can harden them. You can say, look, run SSH, don't run clear text protocols. Run wired, don't run Wi-Fi. Don't run Bluetooth or Bluetooth Low Energy, BLE. Shut these things off. Now push those out to all my printers, or all printers of this version, or everything in building A. So you can do hardening. So that's good. So that reduces the attack surface down greatly. The next part is firmware. Well, it has to be agentless. because you can't put agents on IoT devices. That's one of the reasons that traditional IT tools don't work. So you need this centralized agentless structure, such as an enterprise IoT security platform, that can in an automated way go out and upgrade the firmware on these devices. And usually the way that works is these devices, these enterprise IoT security platforms, they run on-prem usually, or from a cloud, like a private cloud like Amazon, for example. Most of them have been Dockerized. And they run from these environments, and they have all the firmware, old and new, sitting in like a Google Cloud. It's all been cryptologically checksummed, all the communication's encrypted, they've been verified, so you've got all these verified firmwares, so you don't have to hunt the firmware for this device and that device and that device, multiplied by 50,000, try to find it, then go ahead and upload it to the device and figure out, how do I actually communicate with this device? How do I have to upload it? It's a nightmare. It could take you an hour or more per device, easy. With this model, that firmware is in the cloud. If you want to update 5,000 printers at once, or during some change management window, or everything in building A today and building B tomorrow, however you want, it makes it very easy. And in some cases, you want to even downgrade it. You go, oh, well, I'm on version 5 of my firmware, but version 5 has a log4j vulnerability. The vendor knows they're not going to have version 6 for 3 more weeks. But maybe I got to go down to version 3 for now, because that didn't have log4j. So I might want to downgrade that just because log4j is in the news and everybody and their sister is running these attacks right now. So that can cause a problem. So being able to upgrade and downgrade firmware is a huge gain. Once I discover the device, the first thing I want to do is make sure it's on the latest version of the firmware. And I have to be 100% accurate. You don't want to turn a $2 million MRI device into a $500 printer. So that's why accuracy is so key when you're doing this type of analysis. And furthermore, when you're doing the firmware, some devices let you jump from version 3 of the firmware right to version 6. Some devices say you have to go 3, then 4, then 5, then 6. That's why during the discovery phase and that interrogation, that C3PO process that we talked about, communicating in the native language, you don't just get the information about the device, but all the supporting intelligence about how are these devices upgraded? What's the process? What are their capabilities? The next thing is managing credentials and certs. So I found the device. I've got the firmware locked down. Now I want to address these credentials, these default credentials. So a lot of these enterprise IoT security platforms will integrate with PAM tools, CyberArk, HashiCorp, Thycotic, tools like that. And during discovery, they can even automatically enroll these devices in the PAM, which is pretty cool. And when you're doing this, you can set policies. You can say, look, for all these devices, I want to rotate the passwords every 30, 60, 90 days. I want these passwords to be complex. I want them to be 20 characters long. Well, just like with the firmware, knowing that upgrade path, the enterprise IoT security platform needs to know, hey, you know what? This thing only takes a 4-digit PIN. Or this device can use upper and lower case, but not special characters. Or this device can't use a hyphen or the letter B. We've seen all sorts of crazy things in this world. But knowing that, you can create these policies, again, based on that device, because you've done that interrogation, you understand what that device can do, just like with the firmware, now you're actually applying the same concept to credentials, which is really nice. And then the same thing can be applied to certificates as well. Because just like that, knowing where the device is or what firmware or password, usually the certs are problematic. It's on like TLS version 1.1. It's maybe a self-signed cert. It expired a long time ago. So by integrating with those systems, you're actually able to validate and ensure that the certificates are strong as well on those devices. So I found the device. I've hardened it. I fixed the firmware. I've got the credentials and the certificates working great. Everything's humming along. And I want to make sure that thing that's working now is working tomorrow and working next week, next month, next year in perpetuity. We call that environmental drift. Things always happen, right? Things that were working stop working. Things can be hacked. Things can just break. There's mechanical fatigue. There's all sorts of problems that can happen in IT and IoT. We all know that. So if you have an automated way of interrogating, just like during the initial interrogation, usually best practice is to have a daily test from your enterprise IoT security platform that's going to go out and talk to your devices once a day, or maybe one building a day or one region a day, however you want to break it up, to make sure that they're working the way they're supposed to work. If all of a sudden it says, hey, you were on version 6 of the firmware, but now you're back to version 3, or you did have a password that was managed by CyberArk or something, but now it looks like it's back to a default password, or the password was changed and the PAM tool didn't change it because the enterprise IoT security platform has to act as that intermediary between the PAM and the IoT devices, because PAMs can't talk to IoT, but enterprise IoT security platforms can talk to IoT and can talk to PAM. So because of that, it has all that notion of state. Or somebody walked by and committed an insider threat attack, with a paperclip. If you take a paperclip and you walk to the back of a lot of IoT devices, there's a little black reset button. And if you depress that, it sets everything back to the default firmware, default password. And it's called a paperclip attack. So if these paperclip attacks are committed, it's going to drop these things back down. And there could be a valid reason for resetting a box, right? Or it could be malicious, but you don't know at the time. Now, because these enterprise IoT security platforms are integrated with tools like Splunk and ServiceNow and Demisto and other types of management tools and ticketing systems, you're made aware by exception. So you could have 50,000 devices, but now you're aware that, hey, but it was this one device or these 5 devices that changed today or this week that I need to focus on right now. Those are the ones that I need to address. And that's powerful. That allows you to scale. So when you talk about the ability of an automated platform to allow you to scale and address a really vast, complex IoT network that has multiple communication protocols and hundreds of different ways to upgrade firmware and all these different things going on, now you can actually do it. Now you can actually manage those passwords, those firmwares, and monitor those devices to make sure that nothing malicious has actually occurred or there wasn't some type of fault. So again, really, really powerful capability of having both monitoring for that environmental drift and insider threat, and then integrating with all the tools that you're using on the IT side. So you have your alerting through your SIM, through your ticketing system, through your source systems, things of that nature. And then finally, reporting. So you're doing all this great stuff with all your IoT devices, but now I need regulatory or policy compliant reports that kind of show me where I stand. I want to know, one, can you just tell me how many devices I have, of what device type and version, and grab all that information. Tell me firmware values, what firmware is end of life, what devices do I have actually enrolled in my PAM. Maybe I have 50% and I'm shooting for 90% by the end of the quarter, so you can track that. Services. Do I have Telnet turned on, or FTP or TFTP? What type of CVEs do I have? How many devices do I have that have level 10 CVSS scores, right? Or how many do I have that are 8 or higher? And then I want to break it up maybe based on model. Show me all my cameras. Okay. Show me all my access cameras. Great. Show me all my access cameras that are firmware older than 2 years. So I can get really, really detailed. So having that those built-in reports is an extremely powerful piece. And then finally, you might want to have all of that reporting capability piped out via API into some of your existing reporting tools that you're using for IT. So that's really, really common. So these enterprise IoT security platforms, generally speaking, are going to have an API capability to integrate all that reporting data out, so you don't have to have a separate report for IoT, a separate report for IT. Things can be integrated. Again, it's all about scalability. It's all about making sure that this isn't going to take a lot of extra time, because there's a lot of devices. I mean, you might have more IoT devices than you have IT devices that you're trying to manage, but you don't want to stack on more and more tools, but you do want more and more capability. So to summarize, IoT devices, they're virtually always vulnerable. I wish there was another way to say that. It just sucks, hence the title of the presentation. Historically, it was really hard to just find these devices. Just say, I don't even know what I have. I know I got a bunch of cameras and some door locks, I think, and I don't know, lights out management. I hadn't even thought of that. But just finding them, that's a problem. Then the next step, of course, is once they're found, remediating the risks, which is the bigger part of the equation, right? I just don't want to find it. I want to fix it. And then I want to keep it fixed, right? So that's really important. And now there's solutions to help with this, right? Enterprise IoT security platforms, somewhat of a newer concept in this world. And I put a couple versions down here. Of course, this is something that Phosphorus does, but we're not the only people that play in IoT security. You can take a look at some of these other vendors. Everybody has a little bit of a different approach to this. Some a little bit more legacy, some a little bit more modern. But now these tools can help you discovering the device and what vulnerabilities are on my device, updating my firmware, managing those credentials and those certificates and hardening those devices. And then what's really critical is integrating with all my other IT security tools for logging, for SOAR capability, for ticketing systems. And then being able to pull all that together with a reporting capability that makes this easy for me to manage at scale. And if you're able to do this, not only are you able to sort of discover your IoT environment and lock it down, but you're able to do it at scale with these automated tools and make these devices secure. You're just not hiding them off in a VLAN. You're just not closing your eyes and hoping nothing bad's going to happen. And you're greatly reducing the risk on your organization with something that's very easy to do. In most cases, running discovery from these enterprise IoT security platforms is like running a vulnerability scan, right? The firmware is just kept up there. You don't have to go hunt for the firmware yourself. The integration, API integration with the PAM tools is already there. It just works and it just fits. So something you probably want to check out if you're trying to address your IoT security. So again, my name is Brian Contos. I'm the Chief Security Officer with Phosphorus Cybersecurity, and thanks so much for your time.